Welcome to our first session of IJNR's Great Lakes Energy Futures Workshop. What we wanted to do before we get into the weeds on all the different things we were kind of talking about in introductions is give you guys all the kind of 101 level overview of where we're at from a technology and policy perspective, what the pledges are they being met, where do we go from here, all that kind of stuff. And so we have a couple of awesome speakers here who are going to get us up to speed. This first session, we have Michael Craig, who is an assistant professor in energy systems at the University of Michigan's School for Environment and Sustainability. He's director of the Advancing Sustainable Systems Through Low Impact Energy Technologies, or the ASSET Lab, well done on the acronym, where his team focuses on developing and applying advanced energy system models to equitably reduce environmental impacts while enhancing resilience to climate change, emphasizing decarbonization, and climate adaptation, and equity. Michael is also a program faculty at the Institute of Public Utilities and a contributing author to the IPCC reports. Before Michigan, he was a research engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and holds a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, an MS from MIT, and he did his undergrad work at Washington University in St. Louis. So thank you, Michael, for being with us. Michael's going to go first, and then you're going to hear from Angela Shu. She joined the Illinois Environmental Council as the Municipal Engagement Manager in the fall of 2023, where she works on policy issues surrounding clean energy and water, including advancing the IEC's efforts to implement the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a major player in these energy discussions we're going to be having. Angela holds a Juris Doctor degree from Stetson University College of Law with a concentration in environmental law and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Studio from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Prior to her job at the Illinois Environmental Council, Angela worked on environmental initiatives for Sierra Club, Our Children's Trust, Ocean Conservancy, Friends of the Chicago River, and others. So thank you, Michael and Angela. We're excited to have you both here. And Michael, I think the last thing we need to do is make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. And without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
By the way, did we get any of our bio wrong for you, Michael?
Nope, it was great. Thank you very much. All right, so let me get this set up. I'm working from home today. Can everybody see the right screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much. It's really great to be here and to talk to you all. So I was given 20 minutes to basically answer 3 questions: where we are, where we're going, and how we're going to get there in decarbonizing our energy system. And I'm going to do my best in 20 minutes to do that. But I teach, whole semester courses on individual graphs that I'm going to show you basically, but also a whole semester course on basically these 3 questions right here. So, afterwards, Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk more about anything that I talk about or things that I miss. And then, at any point in the future, please, if you have questions or want to chat more about something, let me know, and I would be more than happy to. But what I'm going to try to do today, again, is to answer these 3 questions: where we are, where we're going, and how we get there. All right, so each of the slides that I'm going to show you is going to be probably a pretty busy graph with just like the benchmark, the signposting of which of those 3 questions we're answering. So in each slide, I'm just going to walk us through the figure that we're looking at, hoping to build some ability to interpret scientific graphs, which can get very opaque very quickly, especially with IPCC reports. And then I'll highlight the main things that I think are of most importance, but in all these graphs, there's lots more to dig into. So can I see a show of hands? Who has seen one of these plots before? All right, so a couple of people. So this is a Sankey diagram. It's from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. It's a little bit old. It's from 2021. But the idea is the figure is showing us where our energy comes from on the left-hand side, our primary energy. It shows us where that energy is used, whether in producing electricity or in the different end-use sectors: residential, commercial, industrial, and transport. And then it also shows us how much of the energy we started with we actually use in energy services versus how much we rejected, meaning we wasted energy. So 3 large categories of insights that we can get from this figure. So the first on the left are our primary energy sources. These are where we're getting energy from to power different parts of our energy sector. So we've got petroleum on the bottom, that's oil. We can see oil. If we take this big green bar and we just see it flow through, most of that oil is going into transport. A smaller amount goes to industrial, and then a very small amount is used in residential and commercial for home heating. None of it basically is used in generation. So we've got this huge trunk of oil being used in transport. And when we use that oil in transport, a lot of it is just wasted. This is inefficiencies in our vehicles and in other parts of the system. And so about 5/6 of it just gets thrown out right off the bat. We've got biomass, coal, natural gas, geothermal, wind, hydro, nuclear, and solar as our other sources of primary energy. So we can think of renewables as one thing that we want to grow. We've got our renewables at the top on the left-hand side. Wind, hydropower, and solar, from the perspective of all energy we use, are still a very small portion of that renewable energy. And geothermal we could throw in there as well. So we've got renewables, we'll see how much they've grown, but still a small slice. Nuclear is providing a lot of our electricity generation as well. And then we've also got natural gas providing a lot of energy in our energy sector. And then in these pink boxes, again, we've got our different sectors of the end uses. So we use energy in our households, in commercial buildings, in industrial, and in transportation. So they are directly consuming some of that energy. And then they're also consuming electricity that we produce in the electricity sector, which is also consuming energy. So if we think of how do I reduce emissions in the United States? Well, these are the boxes that you're really dealing with. I need to reduce emissions in the electric power sector. I need to reduce emissions in my households, in my commercial buildings, and in my industrial buildings, and in my transportation sector. And so if I want to get to, say, net zero emissions, I'm either zeroing out all these boxes in terms of the emissions that come from them, or I'm somehow having positive emissions and balancing it with carbon dioxide removal, which we'll talk about later. All right, so this is a high-level overview of the entire energy sector. Recently, a lot of the exciting stuff a lot of the substantial progress we've been making, I'd say, comes from the electric power sector in particular. And so this shows us a time series of how that power sector has evolved from 1950 all the way up through 2021. And so here, this bottom wedge is coal. The big story in the last 20 years in the power sector is the decreasing amounts of coal that we've been using to produce electricity. And you can see that wedge peaked around 2008, 2009. And then for a variety of reasons, that wedge has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Coal used to be our primary source of electricity. It is no longer, and that trend will continue in the next few years. What's been happening as coal has been shrinking? Well, that blue wedge has been increasing. That's our natural gas. We've been using a lot more natural gas. And we've also had more nuclear and really more renewables coming online as well. So natural gas and renewables over the last 10, 20 years, displacing coal, has been a big way that we've been reducing emissions and making progress. But you can imagine, again, if I don't want any emissions from my power sector, the brown wedge on the bottom, the blue wedge second from bottom, we need to get rid of those entirely with the green and the red. So good work done already, lots of work still to be done. We can also think about where our greenhouse gas emissions come from by sector. So before we were looking at energy consumption basically, but ultimately what we care about are emissions. And so again, a time series here showing us from 1990 through 2021, where our emissions come from in different parts of the energy sector, whether that's transport, agriculture, electric power, commercial, residential, or industry. And so here we've got emissions increasing from 1990 through about 05, 06, and then slightly decreasing on a bumpy road through 2021. And so every year there's an inventory that the Environmental Protection Agency releases. So this is the inventory that is most recent. It goes through 2021. And every year there is many news articles that talk about here's how emissions change from the prior year. Sometimes they increase, sometimes they decrease. I think it's important for us to keep in mind the long-term trajectory. There's a downward slope happening here. But again, if we want to get to zero emissions at some point, we need that trajectory to get much steeper downwards, and we would need to get all these emissions down to zero at some point. So again, still lots of work to do, and we have lots of work to do in every sector. The electric power industry used to be the highest emitter of CO2 in the US economy. This blue wedge here, like if you look at 05, the blue wedge is the largest. But because we've been making good progress in reducing coal-fired generation in the electric power sector, actually transport is now the #1 emitting sector. And so we see progress in one sector, but all of these, we still have a long way to go to reduce their emissions. These are all from the US perspective. I don't want to forget where we are globally, because that's just an important context to keep in mind. The United Nations Environmental Program releases a report every year called the Emissions Gap Report, which is a really great source of tracking how global emissions are doing. And also what they do there is they say, all these countries have given us nationally determined contributions, NDCs, commitments to reduce emissions, basically. And so what UNEP does is they collect all these commitments from countries, and they ask, how do those commitments compare to the reductions that we need to meet certain climate targets, like a 2 degrees Celsius future. And so this gap report, again, it's updated annually. It's a really, really great source of information. But what this is showing us is just global greenhouse gas emissions over time. And so while the United States peaked around 05 and has been declining since, we see globally there was a dip in 2020 with COVID, but in general, we still are seeing an upward trend in emissions year on year. I'd say that trend has flattened, so that's good. Hopefully we're going to get to no increases year to year and then decreases year to year. But right now we still see a slight upwards trajectory. So in the United States, lots of work. Globally, also lots of work. And on the bottom here, the different colors here are different greenhouse gas emissions. We typically, or oftentimes, we focus only on carbon dioxide because it's the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. But there are certainly other greenhouse gas pollutants, methane or CH4, nitrous oxide or N2O, and others as well. And so this is showing you how large each of those different sources of emissions are. All right, so that's kind of where we are at a high level in the United States and globally. The next thing I want to talk about is where are we trying to get to? Because it's good to know where we are, but we have to have some benchmarking in mind for the future to understand how much more quickly we need to act, how we are doing in terms of our commitments. So in this section, I'm going to pull from 2 different reports. One is this 2016 report from the Obama administration. It was the US Mid-Century Strategy. And this strategy was written around the time of the Paris Agreement, which was about a decade ago. The United States and other countries made commitments to reduce their emissions in line with a 2 degrees Celsius future. That was the Paris Agreement. And so the United States the White House wrote this report to say, here's how we plan on actually meeting our commitment. This is what we're going to do to reduce our emissions. And so the left-hand side of this figure is a historic record of emissions. We basically already saw this figure a couple of slides ago, except it stops at 2014. You can see those increasing emissions through 2005, the decreasing through 2014. And then what this report does is it says, what do we need to do to get down to our future commitments that we made under the Paris Agreement? And these are all 80% reduction scenarios. So how do I reduce my emissions to 80% under a benchmark scenario, which is, their best guess for what the future might look like? What if I don't remove any CO2? And what if I had limited sinks in terms of land use? And so this arrow is basically saying, over this 36-year period, somehow we need to get our emissions all the way down to here. Now, I want to talk about CO2 removal just for a minute. The bars here, you can see that on the benchmark bar, for instance, the blue emissions line here is about 2.5, and there's this dotted dash line somewhere in the blue bar. What this is showing us is gross CO2 emissions, and then this is showing us our net emissions. And the net emissions are lower than those because of this hatched area at the bottom. This hatched area are CO2 removal technologies. They are removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing them somehow. You might have read about direct air capture, which is basically blowing air over a liquid in order to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We can think of that in terms of bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration as well. There's all sorts of different CO2 removal technologies. But the important thing here is, even if we only want to reduce emissions by 80%, not 100%, just 80, which is a 2 degrees Celsius world, these scenarios really say you have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It's not enough to just reduce how much you put into the atmosphere. And in removing it, you can get your gross emissions down to some net emissions target that you have. And I will note that this middle bar here is our no CO2 removal technology scenario. So here they don't have any hatching. That means that our emissions have to be even lower than they were before. All right, so we got to drag our emissions down 80% under this framework in order to meet our Paris agreements. They go sector by sector in this report and ask, where will we get those 80% emission reductions from? And these three colored bars here are showing us their three platforms for reducing emissions. We transform the energy system, we sequester carbon via CO2 removal and land sinks, and then we reduce our non-CO2 emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, and F gases. So in transforming the energy system, we can see those sectors that we saw before coming back. We've got transportation and buildings and industry. We get some emissions reductions from each of them. None of them are going to zero, but we're getting emissions reductions from each of them. And then in this decarbonizing electricity bar, we get a lot of emissions reductions from wiping out emissions from electricity. A key decarbonization strategy, no matter which report, which country really you look at, is you tackle electricity first, and then you deal with everything else later. And so here we see electricity getting really steep emission reductions because it's cheap and it's relatively easy to do. And there's also fuel switching here, things like electrifying cars, using low carbon fuels for aviation or what have you. And so again, this 80% reduction strategy is built on transforming the energy system, sequestering carbon, reducing non-CO2 emissions. And this would all happen from 2016 through 2050 under this study. I said I'd talk about two studies in this report. The second one I want to talk about is a study from Princeton University. It's called Net Zero America. So the prior report was looking at an 80% emissions reduction. That was from 2005 levels by 2050. So we still have some emissions in that system in the future. In this net zero scenario that this report talks about, we don't have an 80% reduction, we have a 100% reduction. And so it's steeper cuts here than in the prior report, steeper cuts intended to mitigate climate change more than the other report would. And we use the phrase net zero here because it's not that we have no emissions anywhere, we still have some emissions, but what we also have as we have those emissions is our carbon dioxide removal. These wedges at the bottom below the zero line on the y-axis, we have emissions from our cars because many of them are still using oil. We have emissions from our natural gas plants in our electric industry. We have emissions from industry because a lot of industrial facilities are still using gas, E50 in these very aggressive scenarios. But we offset all of those emissions from all those other places with removal of CO2 from the atmosphere in other parts of our energy sector. And that positive and negative balance out to get to net zero. And so this report shows us many different ways to get to net zero. These labels here is a reference, like what if we don't try? And then there's E+, E-, E-, B+, whatever. The letters are all just saying, here are 5 different ways of getting to net zero. Some with high electrification and efficiency, some with low electrification and efficiency, some with a focus on buildings or renewables or only using renewables maybe. Lots of different ways, all of which we can think of how we can get to net zero with them in 2050. And you can see the colored wedges here are different sources of where our emissions come from, and they're all generally declining rapidly from now through 2050. And so these are pretty straight line figures. A challenging part of reducing our emissions is that we're not going to start tomorrow and do equally well tomorrow as we are in 2049. Maybe it takes us a while to get our act together before things really start reducing. And so the longer we wait, the more and more radical we have to take action later. All right, so this is the last, where are we going? We saw the 80%, how steep we have to go, net zero, again, even more reductions. And in both of those scenarios, we don't get everything to zero. We have some emissions happening, but we also remove CO2 at later on as well. All right, so we've seen where we are, we've seen where we need to go to, and the last thing that I wanted to talk about is briefly, how do we get there? And again, I'm going to refer back to the 2 reports that we already talked about. This is the Net Zero America, and they have 6 strategies that they say we need. no matter how you actually want to get to the net zero system, you might use a lot of renewables or a lot of nuclear or whatever. These 6 strategies are common across all those different pathways. And so the first is we need more energy efficiency and we need more electrification. This could be for buildings, for households, for industry, for other parts of our energy sector. The second one is we need to build more clean electricity, a lot more renewables, especially wind and solar. Maybe we want more different types of geothermal or hydropower. We need more transmission, but we also need other types of clean electricity, maybe nuclear, maybe bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. So more electricity from zero carbon sources. The third pillar here is clean fuels. We might not electrify all of our vehicles. We need fuels in other parts of our sector like aviation and maritime. And so we need to make clean fuels, whether that's from bioenergy or hydrogen or synthesized fuels or syn fuel. The fourth pillar is capturing and storing CO2, in part in order to have the carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, but this also just provides us other flexibility in our decarbonization strategies. The fifth pillar, reducing non-CO2 emissions. So this could be getting rid of methane emissions or leaks from our natural. And finally, number 6, more land sinks. This could be read as plant more trees because those trees absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So 6 pillars, not one of these is enough to do any net zero scenario built in this report. You need all 6 of these pillars according to this report to get to a net zero future. And I would say these pillars are very common as well. If you look globally at the IPCC reports, they might not use these same words, but they certainly use the same strategies. Become more efficient, electrify, get clean electricity, get clean fuels, and then deal with other things like non-CO2 emissions and land sinks. This is showing us the magnitude of what they're talking about. The strategies are reflected in these very colorful bars here. We've got the current baseline 2020 on the left-hand side, where we get our primary energy supply from. This is going all the way back to that very first diagram, right? We had those boxes on the left-hand side where our energy is from. This is just another way of showing it stacked up to 100. We've got 2050 reference. What if we don't try to decarbonize? Well, we probably won't do well. We've still got a lot of fossil fuels in our economy like oil and gas and coal. We've still got really high CO2 emissions. And then they build these pathways that show us here are 5 different ways to get to net zero emissions. The bottom wedges here, this brown and the tan, these are the fossil fuel emitters in our economy, oil, gas, and coal. You can see coal is basically gone. Like there's just no more coal in 2050. Really, it's gone by like 2030 in the study. So very quick phase out of coal, a lot less oil and gas, but it's still there. We still have oil, we still have gas, we're still using them. And that means we still have emissions coming from those oil and gas consumers, which is why we need to remove CO2 separate from that in order to get to net zero. And you can see the light blue and the yellow here are wind and solar. You can see a lot more renewables being built in all of these future scenarios relative to where we are now. And they've got some expansion of other sources as well. All right, I have my last slide here, which is not from the Net Zero America report, but back to that White House report, the 80% reduction scenario. They broke out where they get their changes from in terms of how much they're producing electricity, how much is being consumed by sector. And so the primary energy up top, this figure up here is like the sum of all these other figures, but the strategies here are very similar to Net Zero America. In electricity, this sub-figure, you can see green is low carbon. It just means renewables, nuclear, bioenergy, whatever, any low carbon source. We have way more low carbon electricity generated through 2050. We basically get rid of coal. We almost get rid of gas. Very similar to the Net Zero America, even though radically different way of writing the report and of creating their recommendations. Transport. It's not that we don't consume oil anymore. This pink bar in transportation is oil. There's still a lot of oil being used in transportation. So we still have those emissions happening, even though we have made really great progress on reducing our emissions. Buildings, not much changing in buildings. We still have a lot of oil being used and gas being used. But here we have some electrification success, and so we electrified our buildings. And then industry, generally the stickiest of our sectors to change. And we see, you know, kind of the same, just more electricity, less other fuel use in industry. So in both of these cases, well, especially in this figure, it's showing us that not all the sectors are treated equally. We don't get the same emissions and the same transformation. Really, electricity does a lot of the heavy lifting, and then we get other benefits from transport, buildings, and industry. All right, so thank you for looking at a lot of complex figures with me. I will, thanks for your attention as well, and I'll stick around and answer questions after.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael. That was perfect way to kick this off. Angela, you are up and you should be able to share your screen.
All right, wonderful. Let me go. Okay, can everyone see this okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Amazing. All right. So thank you, Michael, for kicking that off. And hi, everyone. My name is Angela Schutter, and I am the Municipal Engagement Manager with the Illinois Environmental Council. Thank you so much to the IJNR for your time today. So I'll be presenting on some background on the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal policies, and how they're shaping what our energy systems look like, especially in Illinois and the Great Lakes region. So this is very much meant to be a high-level presentation and not exhaustive. As you likely know, there's copious federal programs. It'll take an entire day to cover every funding opportunity. So I hope to cover a few of the major programs that we've been seeing, and I'm very open to connecting with anyone after today's presentation if you have any further questions, especially when it comes to storytelling. A little bit about IEC. So we were founded in 1975. We are an member-based organization with over 100 environmental organizations operating in Illinois. We advance equitable public policies to create healthy environments across Illinois through collaboration, building power, and advocacy. So a little background, signed into law in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest investment in clean energy in United States history. We're talking $783 billion on energy and climate change. So these are once in a generation investments that give money directly to people. Rebates and tax credits will cut costs for renewable energy, from electric vehicles to appliances to solar power. The Inflation Reduction Act is a tremendous way that our nation is confronting the climate crisis and looking to the future. There's several programs under the IRA. For example, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant helps states, local governments, and metropolitan statistical areas plan and implement policies and projects that achieve or facilitate climate pollution reduction. In Illinois, project proposals and applications are submitted to the Illinois EPA. The United States EPA's $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or the GGRF, which I will be referencing a lot in this presentation, provides grants and financing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to communities. These can be used to create state or city green banks, which serve as a source of low-cost capital for clean technology. In 2022, green banks in the United States facilitated around $4.64 billion in clean energy projects. And through direct pay, municipalities are eligible for funding, which makes it easier for local governments to invest in clean energy and allows them to take on bigger projects faster to demonstrate climate leadership. So the IRA also very importantly addresses environmental justice and equity. The Environmental and Climate Justice Program through block grants and community change grants will help implement activities that benefit underserved and overburdened communities, and also engage communities in public processes. These grants also fund climate resilience, air pollution reduction, monitoring and management, workforce development, and more. Through the Low-Income Communities Bonus Credit Program, tax credit amounts will increase when projects employ domestically manufactured parts. Low-income communities are benefited from solar and wind, or when there is energy community economic development. Additionally, through the USDA, there is $145 million in funding through the Rural Energy for America program to help agricultural producers and rural small business owners make energy efficiency improvements and renewable energy investments to lower energy costs, generate new income, and strengthen the resiliency of their operations. Now I'm going to go through some tax credits and rebates. I definitely won't go through all of these because there's just so many, but I wanted to show these slides because they're indicative of just how many opportunities are available to people. So, for example, if you bought an American-made electric vehicle in 2023, you can get up to $7,500 in tax credit back. There's also the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicle Program, providing grants or rebates for replacing heavy duty vehicles with clean zero emission ones. And then the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Refueling Property Credit offers up to 30% of the costs coverage for EV chargers and installation costs, or at most $100,000 per charger. There's also a litany of really great home electrification rebates and tax credits. For example, the home electrification and appliance rebates and the home efficiency rebates are helpful to renters for lowering the cost of purchasing environmentally friendly appliances or home upgrades. And meanwhile, if you're a homeowner, these credits can cover anything from appliances to windows, insulation, even doors are eligible for a 30% tax credit. You can get a $150 tax credit on home energy audits completed in the next decade. And households can continue to receive a tax credit to cover up to 30% of the upfront costs of installing rooftop solar, geothermal, battery storage, at least through 2034. And I just wanted to quickly pause because I know that's pretty dense and a lot of information, just for 3 seconds, just to see if anyone has any questions, and feel free to shout out.
I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah,
They
sure.
all have questions, and if
Okay,
we
great.
open that can of worms, we'll never get back. So
Okay, sounds good. We'll just
Yeah,
keep
fine.
plugging along
Yeah.
then.
Thanks, though.
No, of course. Now I'm going to go through some other federal funding programs. Again, not an exhaustive list, but these are the major ones that we've been seeing, and some avenues that we have been noticing, especially in the Great Lakes region. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the BIL, funds a lot of federal highway transit, aid, safety, motor carrier research, hazardous materials, and rail programs of the Department of Transportation. There's also the Clean School Bus Rebate available to public school districts. I know for fiscal year 23, I believe that got extended through the end of last month. And then we're expecting to see in, I think, Q3 and Q4 of this year for the fiscal year 24 program to start opening. We're going to see that available to public school districts, public charter schools, government entities that provide a bus service, eligible contractors that sell or finance school buses, nonprofit school transportation associations, and tribes. And then the carbon reduction program, also under IIJA, will reduce carbon emissions, work with partner agencies and stakeholders, and will tackle transit and transportation, roadway operations, lower carbon fuels, alternative fuels and energy, and construction and maintenance. The IIJA also funds broadband access and clean water, and also in energy policy, it's going to spend $73 billion, of which $11 billion is invested in electric grid renewal. And some of this money is going to be going towards new loans for electric power transmission lines, and future transmission needs. And there's also $45 billion in innovation industrial policy for emerging technology. The DOE has imposed some grant requirements on $7 billion of the IIJA's battery and transportation spending, which is meant to promote community benefits agreements, social justice, and the formation of trade unions. And lastly, I also want to talk about the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program, or EECBG, a lot of acronyms. This assists eligible governments to reduce fossil fuel emissions, improve energy efficiency, cut costs, and build a clean and equitable energy economy that prioritizes disadvantaged communities. So for example, in Illinois, we were just awarded last month $2.9 million, with Illinois' DuPage County being awarded $450,000 for energy projects, including workforce development. And then I also want to mention Justice 40. This is a project that through the federal government, 40% of overall benefits for federal investments must flow to disadvantaged communities. And so the Justice 40 initiative applies to over 145 DOE programs and to as much as $62 billion of investment in DOE under the BIL. And then additionally, we're seeing a lot of GRIP programs, or the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships. These are for projects across 44 states to strengthen electric grid resilience. And we are seeing that ComEd had a GRIP application that won $50 million. There's also going to be a project funded in Rockford, Illinois for workforce equity, and another project out here in Naperville too. Alrighty. Now moving on to how is this all going to be shaping the energy future in the Great Lakes? So we're seeing new energy technologies rapidly decrease in cost and improve in quality, and we're also seeing an increased global investment in solar energy. In the United States, energy transition investment reached $140 billion in 2022 and expected to more than triple by 2030. In the Great Lakes region, since beginning 2021, we've seen more than $40 billion in new energy transition investments, such as electric vehicles and batteries, and 80% of new and planned electric generation capacity in the region is in solar, photovoltaic, or onshore wind. According to the Rocky Mountain Institute, investments in new electrolyzer, thin film solar, and lithium-ion battery manufacturing are putting the Great Lakes region at the forefront of what's being called an American industrial renaissance. Across the country, we're seeing a historical economic recovery with growing levels of employment, increasing wages, and creating good energy jobs among lower income and marginalized communities. These are powerful motivators for developers and investors to take chances on new energy opportunities. The Great Lakes region has a number of green banks, including the Illinois Finance Authority Climate Bank after the passage of Illinois CEJA Act, which I'll go more into detail later. There's also Michigan Saves and the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority, which had an initial $45 million capitalization with goals to accelerate renewable energy and energy efficiency market growth. And in 2023, the governor of Wisconsin signed an executive order to begin the process of creating a green bank and innovation fund. And Pennsylvania is also looking at another green bank in their states under IRA. So it's in this context that the revitalized economy that the federal government has further injected hundreds of billions of dollars into incentives for communities, energy transition, and blue-collar workers. This approach reshapes the economy to be cleaner, fairer, and more dynamic. So going back to CEJA in Illinois, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, it is a historic law passed in 2021. And in 2022, thanks to the IRA and the GGRF, our Illinois Finance Authority Climate Bank was launched. We're seeking to greenlight more renewable energy developments and quickly integrate with the grid. It's a bold law that puts Illinois on a path to 100% clean energy future by 2045, protecting public health from pollution, providing just transition for communities historically dependent on dirty fossil fuels, and enact tough accountability towards utilities, and also create jobs and wealth in Illinois' Black and Brown communities. It is investing $80 million per year, and CEJA has both near-term and long-term hard requirements with specific dates to reduce and eventually stop burning dirty fossil fuels altogether. Through CEJA, we also created the Clean Energy Jobs and Justice Fund, providing low and zero interest loans for renewable projects in low-income areas. And these are just a few of our goals and our pillars. And on the right, you see a map where we have our Chicagoland area goals, environmental justice areas, and places that we're trying to reinvest and renew. And lastly, there's such a huge importance in storytelling. Starting with CEJA, that was such a great pillar for Illinois because it gave us a head start and infrastructure needed to participate in IRA programs rolling out. So we already had the full advantage of federal resources to deliver good jobs, economic relief to families struggling with high fuel prices, inflation, and weather. We're cutting carbon emissions, we're advancing environmental justice, and we're saving individuals and small businesses money on energy bills through these tax incentives and lower upfront costs. So this is where you all come in. Stories help us see in the cause and effect relationships. We encourage you to strive to include these equity provisions in your coverage, and organizations like IEC can be a resource in identifying these provisions as well. And by providing and celebrating these success stories of an IRA program and how they are benefiting the community, stories create visibility, spread awareness of these available programs, and show that these programs are working. So if you can pair these specific success stories examples with demystifying how readers can similarly access programs benefits, that would be a huge help. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for listening, for your time. Here's my contact information as well as Tucker Berry's contact information. Here's our communications director, and we're very much open to engaging with you in terms of storytelling and media coverage.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Angela. All right, folks. So there was your fire hose of information to get us started, giving that high level view, which we really appreciate. And now is the part where you guys can drag us all into the weeds with your questions. So if you have a question, I just ask that you let us know in the chat bar, and I will call on the order that they are received. We tried this once with the little tiny yellow hands, and it was a madhouse. I couldn't tell who raised first or who to call on. So who wants to lead us off with the question? Kelly House does.
Yeah, I was that graph that showed like different scenarios for how we get to net zero that I think was done by Princeton. Did whoever made that give any weight to like which ones are most realistic and attainable?
Hi, Kelly. Question. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Excellent. So I was going to share the graph, but I think your question, we don't actually need to look at the graph. Did they give weight to ones that are more realistic or feasible? Not really. I would say they created these scenarios thinking we don't really have a good sense in the long run for roadblocks to different sorts of technologies. And so what we want to do is just to create a diverse portfolio of possible ways to get to net zero and understand the implications of each of those so that policymakers and decision makers can then take that information and use it in thinking about how they are trying to lay the groundwork for these different scenarios. And I think depending on who you ask, you will get many different answers in terms of which of these is most likely. You know, there's an all renewable scenario, which just requires wind and solar. Some people would say that is very feasible because we've been doing great with building wind and solar. We just need to do more of it. Other people would say, you know, getting to 100% wind and solar means a lot of other pain points down the road. And so something that's less aggressive on renewables, that leans more on something else is more realistic. So I think, you know, ask 20 people in the field that you will get 20 different answers, which is more realistic.
All right, thanks. Michael Hawthorne has a question.
Hey, thanks for this. Really appreciate your time. I was wondering, given all the money that's going out the door, the Michigan program, the Illinois programs, and then the IRA funded programs, is there any built-in auditing to this in terms of the rollout language for how these things are supposed to work to ensure that the money is being used, quote, wisely, or to track the success or failure of individual projects?
That is a really great question. And so what we're seeing, as far as I've come across, I haven't seen that. I would have to follow up with you after this meeting today. But what from our side with IEC, what we're doing, we're part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. And so we're a huge coalition of different environmental organizations. And we've been in touch with, for example, the Illinois EPA, which has been doing the rollout of the climate pollution reduction grants, which has been receiving and asking for feedback and comments on how this should be equitably rolled out, right? And so through our organization, we are submitting these comments. As far as like a federal auditing system, I'm not so sure, but I would have to look into that.
Michael, did you have any idea on that?
Yeah, I was just wondering. I guess I thought about it because so many groups like IEC, were invested in getting these programs created, right, at the legislative level. But you folks are always usually the folks who also flag the problems. So, I was just curious how that, that tension can be resolved, I guess is what I'm asking.
Right, and so we're directly in contact with agency representatives and other organizations and submitting these comments, and that's a really great question. I know, for example, with the home energy rebates or the home rebates, we are saying we need more measured savings measurements for those tax credits and rebates, or we're looking at modeled savings as well. So encouraging those so that residents are actually going to be saving more or making back more when they do invest in renewables. And so it's kind of through that process that I have seen that happen.
Okay, great. Tiffany, you had a question.
Yeah, for Michael, you talked a lot about ramping up technology-driven carbon capture. And I was wondering in the US, what the main storage methods are for that carbon capture after removing it, and if you have a sense of how much capacity there is in those sinks.
Yeah. So I guess the question, Tiffany, is, are you thinking about right now what the main sequestration method is or storage method is, or do you mean in 2050 in these aggressive scenarios where we'd be putting it?
Both, I guess, because I don't know what existing technology-driven carbon capture exists in the US now.
Okay. Yeah, so we don't have much carbon capture. We used to have a power plant in Texas, Petronova, that was a carbon capture on a coal plant. That has shut down like a year or two ago. There are other pilots ramping up. I think the only project that's actually capturing and sequestering CO2 in a geologic formation is in Illinois, in Archer Daniel Midland's ethanol plant. And by sequestering in a geologic formation, I mean there's a hole in the ground or porous media, miles or thousands of feet underground, and they just put the CO2 in there. And it's called geologic sequestration because the idea is it's capped well underground and it will stay there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So right now, I think that's one example, but usually what we do with CO2 instead is enhanced oil recovery, which is you put the CO2 into an oil reservoir and it helps get more oil out of the reservoir. And so you can read lots of papers about the carbon accounting for, are we actually saving carbon if we use CO2 to get oil out? So right now, I'd say the dominant way we store CO2 is really with enhanced oil recovery in the United States. But when you start going out to 2050, I mean, the majority of CO2 being stored is in geologic formations, really deep underground, whether it's in unminable coal seams or in saline aquifers or in sedimentary basins. Like there's lots of different types of formations, all have their pluses and minuses. And I would say that we're probably going to need to use a lot of them because it is a lot of CO2 being stored in some of these aggressive scenarios. And the National Energy Technology Lab, NETL, they have this carbon storage atlas that shows you a map of the United States and where all the different types of geologic storage formations are, different types, and like where they are. And in most of the country, there's some way to store CO2 really, but there's pockets of really nice sequestration sites and some areas with not much.
Okay. And the National Energy Technology Lab, are they also looking at just like pure amount? I don't know what unit you measure CO2 storage in, but kind of like
yeah,
peak
so
storage.
yeah, I'd say NETL is a good resource for the carbon storage atlas. But if you want like peak amounts, the reports that I showed you today have the peak amounts. So, like the Net Zero America study from Princeton, they have 1.5 billion tons of CO2 being stored. And that's every year, keep in mind. Like these annual time series, that means you store 1.5 billion tons in 2050, and in 2051, and in 2052, and in 2053, so on and so forth for the rest of the time, unless you reduce your emissions elsewhere. And so that accumulates into a lot of CO2. And for reference, like 1.5 billion tons, that's about a third of how much we put into the atmosphere right now. So a third of what goes in, like all emissions from all of our cars, you're taking all those emissions. This is not how it works, but the volume is all those emissions straight underground. So it is a lot of volume that you need.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Nina is up next.
Yeah, thanks. Michael, I'm wondering about natural gas. We're seeing a lot of investment still in infrastructure expansion around natural gas with our utilities. And at what point in these scenarios do we expect that to peak or stop? Or do we still need to develop more natural gas? I guess I'm asking to meet these scenarios.
Yeah, so there will be very different answers in the US versus globally. Globally, natural gas will increase for a long time because the name of the game is first get rid of coal, then go after other things. And one of the ways we get rid of coal globally is we expand natural gas, especially in areas that don't have really good natural gas resources, like, you know, Asia, which is a lot of importing of liquefied natural gas. So on a global basis, you get an increase in natural gas. And, you know, we could go look at an IPCC report, like the most recent one a few years ago. I might guess by 2050 even, we have more natural gas usage globally than we do right now. So, you know, that is growing. In the United States, I like in these 2050 scenarios, there's way less natural gas being used. But I think that the pathway would be you grow it for a while and then it declines for a while. So like maybe through 2030 or 2035, because again, the thing we want to do most is get rid of coal. The sooner we get rid of coal, the easier the rest of the stuff that we need will be. And one of the ways we get rid of coal is having more natural gas. And so I'd assume there's a short-term expansion and then a long-term, you know, decline in natural gas. If you want to think more about natural gas, there's a professor at Notre Dame, Emily Gruber, who thinks about, well, what happens to these infrastructure systems, like all these pipelines, when I'm slowly reducing the natural gas consumption, because it's not like you can, you know, run a pipeline at 20% or 10% capacity. And so there's certainly very sticky real world issues there that all these modeling exercises do not get at all. That might inform the answer of what do we do with this legacy infrastructure asset, and should we be adding to it or not?
Interesting. Thank you.
And I'd say that was very power centric. I mean, in buildings, natural gas is still used a lot for home heating, even in these most aggressive decarbonization strategies. So, and in industry, it's still used. So certainly there's a role for natural gas in the long term. Yeah, and the question of how much will depend on who you ask.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, Audrey, you're up.
My question is actually two questions, and it's one part is probably more for Angela and one part is probably more for Michael, but I'm concerned. I was wondering how something like the Justice 40 initiative would be coordinated or integrated with, especially when you were talking about, Angela, the CEJA, and also Justice 40 wants to reduce the impact of things like disparate effects of carbon emissions and other environmental pollutants in environmental justice communities. So you were talking about carbon sequestration. I can almost talk today, Michael. So I was wondering how that would work, how you would avoid locating all these carbon land sinks in environmental justice communities, or what those considerations would be.
Michael, I don't know if you wanted to comment on the CSS or CCS component first.
Yeah, sure. I can do that first. So, I mean, justice is not really captured in any of the reports that we've been talking about. I mean, in these studies that have been done, like the Princeton study, for instance, they make in their modeling exercise, like in the computer program that they run, there are very specific recommendations. Here is where you build the wind turbines and the solar panels and the carbon capture facilities, and here's where you sequester CO2, on and on and on. But those are done not thinking about where they should go at all. And I think if we think specifically about CO2 sequestration, the places where we'd be sequestering CO2 are going to be far away from population centers where we have good sequestration sites. And we also want to find sites that we think are reliable in terms of holding on to that CO2. So that means that more rural communities would probably be impacted by sequestration activities much more than, more urban communities. And the rural communities then, like, certainly there would be justice considerations around them. But I'm not sure where those sites would actually be in these studies.
Yeah, and adding on, and thank you, that's a really, really good question. And I would say that environmental justice is really baked into the IRA. They use a couple screening tools. There's the climate and economic justice screening tool that tracks disadvantaged communities. They look at like any census block group at or above the 90th percentile of the EJ screens indexes. They compare state versus national. And then also there is the under the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, which we talked about with the community change grants, they also look at different mapping. And so a lot of these projects are specifically going to lower income communities. And when you apply, you have to make that very clear. And so we're seeing a lot of municipalities that are applying for these programs, and they have to report like the demographic makeup, the financial makeup. And so that is very much going to be at every step. And I know, especially for workforce development and when clean energy jobs are being created, we're looking at these need to be, long-term, have good benefits, and we're going to aim to not create these developments in areas that will harm people, but actually, serve them and engage with communities. I hope that answers your question.
Does, but I also, you mentioned not harming environmental justice communities, which I can appreciate. Does that, I'm assuming it also includes like an economic development piece as well?
Yes, absolutely. Economic development, especially in energy, renewable manufacturing, and job creation. And that is like at every single step we're looking at that.
All right, thanks, Angela. Sherry, you had a question.
Hi, thanks to you both very much for your wonderful presentations. Thank you. My question is for Michael. I wondered about that Princeton study, if it factored any public opinion in about what solutions should receive the most effort, and if it doesn't, given your study of this field, what do you suspect is going to be the influence of public opinion on, solutions like large scale wind and solar fields and long range transmission and very specifically nuclear energy?
Yeah, sure. Have you talked to Sarah Mills at U
I
of
sure
M?
have. She's one of my
Yeah,
favorites.
yeah. Sounded like a question that you would talk to Sarah about. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but you're here now, so let's talk.
yeah, I mean the answer is no. They don't think about public perception or opinion at all when they create these scenarios, which you can view as it's a platform for public discussion. Yeah, there's opposition and then different forms of generation, wind, solar, nuclear. I mean, geothermal, I think you will get resistance towards. I think it's a trading off of lots of different factors, one of which is public perception. I don't have an answer for you, which I think is most realistic, because I think it can be very much a moving target, influenced by a lot of different factors. Having more nuclear would be great. It seems like that is very difficult right now, for many different reasons, including public perception. We have a project that we're working on solar, and Sarah obviously works a lot with wind in the Great Lakes region, understanding public perception and community zoning decisions and how those affect solar and wind. They can certainly play a role in making it harder to build those assets. And so I think, one thing is one job that will be for whoever is doing this expansion, industry, government, people advocating for it, is what is the benefit to you of hosting this solar plant or wind plant or nuclear power plant in order to try to change public perception and make these projects that people might not want more palatable. But they all have their own public perception issues, and those are not accounted for in any of this work.
All right, Sherry, you got the answer you probably expected.
Yeah, but it's always nice to talk about it,
It's
isn't
good to
it?
ask, good to ask. All right, Kyle.
So actually I have a couple questions, but I'm going to start with one for Michael because that's just to continue to draw off that. Previously, when I've talked with some people about energy transitions, they've kind of stressed the importance of having like a base load energy. I don't know if this is going to tie into different perspectives on transitions or something, but I was wondering if that was something that you could talk about how that factors into these projections and specifically how, you know, sources like natural gas factor into that.
Sure. So, baseload is describing a power plant that runs all the time at a constant power output. So a nuclear power plant is a perfect example of a baseload facility. The nuclear plant runs at 100% for a year, and then it turns off to refuel, and then you turn it back on, and it runs constantly. So I think, you know, baseload is a descriptive term. It is not. It's purely a description of how a power plant operates. It doesn't have much more meaning beyond that. And so I don't, in my classes, for instance, talk about baseload. I think it's important to understand the concept, but I don't think it's essential that we have baseload power plants in a future grid. We can build power systems without any baseload power plants. It's fine. There is a challenge of how we transition the current system with some very inflexible assets like nuclear power to these future systems. And that might mean turning a lot of them off, which is something that we have to handle, but we don't need the baseload. The Princeton study, they use a different term, which is firm power. And I think that's becoming more and more common in thinking about it, which is firm meaning I can control it, basically. Wind and solar, I cannot control. I cannot produce wind or solar if I don't have wind or solar resources. That is a problem at a certain point. And so what I want is something controllable, and I want that controllable asset to be carbon free. And so they use firm to describe that, and that could be geothermal or advanced nuclear or natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration, whatever. And all those facilities can go up and down and up and down and up and down, not just flatline like a baseload facility would.
All right, and Kyle, did you have another question?
Yeah, I did have another one for Angela. I know I've looked at a number of policies that we have in Michigan. I obviously don't expect you to know the specifics, but I know a lot of them are trying to pull down funding to help alleviate costs in, you know, access to renewable energy for, you know, low-income communities, environmental justice communities. Do you know if there's any sort of guidance baked into the IRA for, you know, how these programs are able to, you know, access that federal funding, you know, or is there certain steps that it needs to meet just by virtue of applying for that funding? I don't know.
Yeah,
if
that's a great question. And it kind of also adds on to Michael Hawthorne's question as well, which is very good. So what we're actually seeing is that and this needs to be elevated even more. And that's what because I've, in my role as a municipal engagement manager, I speak with decision makers and electeds, legislative leaders, as well as people in the community, environmental organizations, and leaders at the grassroots level. And they are aware that these exist, but we're hearing a lot of hesitance and saying, well, if we apply to these, how are we going to have capacity? Who's going to, you know, help us, let us know? There's no guarantee that we'll get it. We're not really sure about when the deadlines are. And so in our role and hoping to connect with you all, we want to elevate the visibility of these and be able to, I know Illinois Environmental Council, and this year our goal is to do town halls, connect with these elected officials in the Illinois area, really connect with the communities, even linking to retailers and contractors who are speaking to homeowners and renters, and let them know about what is available to them, how they can best benefit. For example, through direct pay, municipalities and local governments are seeing a first time that they can benefit from following up with building codes, from, you know, doing electrified fleets. Universities can get rebates too if they get, for example, we spoke with someone who got a lawnmower and got a huge rebate that way. But it's really about elevating and letting them know in how this can be rolled out. And so I know, for example, in Illinois, IEC is working on this, the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance is working on this, Illinois Green Alliance is working on this as well, and just connecting with communities on this rollout. And so on the federal side, agency side, I know that the DOE has an Office of Engagement that has started doing office hours, and they're offering technical assistance where organizations can approach them And I know that US EPA is also doing technical assistance webinars as well. And so we're trying to get that rolled out and getting the word out too.
Great.
Gotcha. And I mean, is there any sort of financial guidance provided in these? I know, a lot of times I look at some of the policies that offer, financial incentives or rebates or things like that for putting in, people in low-income groups to put in things like rooftop solar, things like that. A lot of times it seems like it's a lot of money, but it seems like it might not be enough for those systems. So is there any sort of guidance, provided either through DOE or other institutions there on just what a good target for those, lumps of funds is?
Yeah, I know that there are several fact sheets that are being put out by the Department of Treasury. I know the Citizens Utility Board put out a fact sheet. And let me see, there's also a calculator by Rewiring America. I'll drop it in the chat for where people can just go on there and see how they can invest in what they will actually get back if they enter their information about their household, about their income level. But other financial guidance I haven't seen yet personally.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, Francisco had a question. If there were no other questions, and I don't see any other questions currently in the chat bar, so Francisco, go for it.
Yeah, my question was more about the energy rebates. You highlighted some of them. I just wondering if you had any insight as far as the rebates, because so the IRA, has all this money to go for states to go to these energy rebates programs. However, considering that the Illinois passed CEJA and has these aggressive climate goals, do you have any insight as to why Illinois isn't one of the early applicants? Because I'm looking at the list, and they like New York, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, they all have early use of administrative funding. Would you have any insight on why Illinois didn't apply for early use of those funds?
So that is actually a great question, and that was one that I raised with our team last week. And so let me actually see if I can pull this up, because that's what I was wondering as well. And so we've actually been through the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition been trying to reach out to the Illinois EPA. What I can say for now is just government. I really am not too sure, but after looking around a bit more, this is what I did find. Okay. Give me one moment. I'm gonna pull up my timeline here and see what I can find.
Just so folks know, I'll be saving any of the links that get shared during these in the chat that we will have in a resource for you along with the speaker roster and all that info. And there was a question about slides. We will, as long as speakers, are open to this, we will follow up with them on after each presentation and share those slide decks with you too. And then finally, for some of you, I've noticed you don't have your names or affiliations necessarily next to your face on Zoom. So if you can update that so our speakers know who you work for and who you are when you're asking them questions, that would be great.
All right, so
Hey, Adam,
Francisco,
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
No, Adam, I didn't want to interrupt before, but I was looking around my phone. Do you know, is it in settings or where you go to change your ID for your affiliation?
Oh, I might be able to do that for you because I don't on the phone. Ooh, but I have the power to rename you, Tom.
Yeah.
Nice.
I'm
I'd like to be
keeping
named. I'd like to be named Dave Spratt.
Yeah, nope, sorry. That name's taken. And for those of you who don't know, that's our director, and he will be on other workshops, but he got a new bionic knee like 2 days ago, so he's not camera ready at the moment. Okay, Angela, I think you found what you were looking for.
Yeah, so this is through our contacts. So in Illinois as a state is going to notify the United States DOE of our intent. And we have our state applications are due at the federal level in January 2025. Our appropriations were received July last year. And then now we're in the first quarter of submitting applications from the state. And then in mid 2024, we're going to release the request for proposals. And then late 2024, early 2025, the rebates will become available in Illinois. And so I hear you, Francisco. On our side, we've been trying to reach out to the Illinois EPA in terms of what is going on. We've also been trying to reach out to them in terms of the climate pollution reduction grants, because we're seeing that roll out across the state. We have the Chicago Metropolitan Statistical Area that's applying, and then on a statewide level, the IEPA has been also applying. But in terms of where that is, we heard that the request for proposals closed January 19, but we're working with the governor's office to still get some more applications in, because we haven't really seen that communication being rolled out in a smooth way. Not many people caught on that that was a deadline that was going to close. So we're still working with our community organizations and trying to get everything in and work with those connections.
Thank you so much for looking into that.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Zaria, you had a question.
Hi, Angela, I have a question. I know you touched on the rebate programs available to homeowners. I'm wondering if there's anything available for renters, or if you know of any programs available for renters, or maybe if that's included in some of that environmental justice work that's going on through the IRA or the IIJA.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are specific benefits for for renters versus for homeowners. And so if you're a renter, you can, let me see. And I can share this with everyone after the presentation too. So for renters, there's the home electrification and appliance rebates and home efficiency rebates. So you can cover the cost of purchasing heat pumps, induction electric stoves, electric vehicle chargers, HVAC appliances, electrification project costs. And depending on income, you can be eligible for like covering half or to the entire cost of an upfront discount up to $14,000 in addition to a tax credit. And then comparatively, let's say you own the home and you're purchasing windows or doors, insulation, then you can be eligible for a 30% tax credit. So there very much is specific benefits for whether you're a renter or homeowner. And also if you're a single household versus a multifamily household. And they look at multifamily households, or if you are a landlord or owner of a large commercial building, or of a building that has multiple units in it, there's also specific benefits for those too.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks, Angela. And Julie Grant.
Hi, Michael, I had a question. I was interested in sort of the carbon storage that you're talking about. Is there like a national effort to kind of identify where these would happen, and are there safety issues with that at all? Is there any concern about, I don't know. I mean, like, how do they actually, I don't know. I'm thinking about like wastewater from like a fracking site getting like injected underground, and the concerns about the movement of that through the geology. And I wonder if there's any kind of similar concerns with something like carbon storage.
Yeah, so I'll go in reverse order. There are concerns when you inject anything underground in terms of affecting geologic formations, maybe inducing tremors if you're not doing it well, or earthquakes even. There could be contamination of aquifers, I think, with CO2. So there are certainly concerns. The Environmental Protection Agency has a class of underground injection wells. They are the UIC class 6, I believe, is for geologic sequestration. So, the EPA thinks that they have figured out the right rules and regulations that prevent those bad things from happening. And the other, it's not really a safety concern, but another huge concern is making sure this CO2 stays underground. And so monitoring and verifying where that CO2 plume is going and making sure it's all staying underground is important. It's not staying underground. It's not doing anything for climate change. So it has to stay under there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's on the safety thing. On the coordination, I mean, the NETL, the National Energy Technology Lab, which, you know, is right near Pittsburgh, that they are the organization that I think would be exerting the most coordinating effort. They have the Carbon Storage Atlas. There have been rounds of funds for demonstration projects for geologic sequestration. Those were back in like 08 and 09, I think. They might have had a new round recently, but those are like really old projects, but those were trying to understand what's underground in certain places. Otherwise, no, there's not really, as far as I can tell, a lot of coordination on it. And for the scale of infrastructure you would be talking about in these aggressive CO2 removal or carbon capture scenarios, like that's a lot of infrastructure being built. I don't think there's a good coordinating entity right now. And there's not even, if you think of gas pipelines, the agency that oversees gas pipelines is, I believe, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They have control over interstate natural gas pipeline siting, which means you can use eminent domain. They're like on point for safety. I think NHTSA is also involved. Like there's not even a clear regulatory structure for CO2 pipelines defined yet interstate. And so there's all sorts of challenges that remain to be resolved. And I'll give you a book chapter I wrote with some people at Harvard Law like a decade ago. So it's old, but I'd say 99% of it is still relevant because not much has changed in the intervening decade.
Welcome to the environment beat. That sentence just completely summed it up. I've been doing this since 2007, and every single thing we've ever done with reporters is still relevant. And probably the same people could be sources for it. It's crazy. All right. We have one more quick question from Kelly, and then one more quick comment, I think, from Michael wanted to, Hawthorne, the Chicago Tribune one, wanted to share, and we can wrap things up. So Kelly, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, really quickly piggybacking off that last question. Where are the identified spots for carbon capture? And like Michigan, for instance, has a lot of natural gas storage right now that obviously would hopefully be less relevant in the future. Could that be a candidate for repurposing for carbon sequestration? Or is there a map somewhere of where those like ideal spots are?
Yeah, there's a map. The atlas is huge, so it's loading right now. Maybe the other comment can be made, and then we can come back to this, and I'll just share my screen and we can look at the map together.
Yeah, and we shared that earlier, Kelly, in the chat, a link to that, and we'll make sure we share it after this too, so it doesn't just disappear with the chat. But while that loads, Michael, other Michael, go nuts.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I mean, my colleague Nara Schoenberg has been writing about this a lot, this carbon capture issue, and I've written a little bit about it in the past too, but you know, ethanol companies in the Midwest have this idea that they're going to pipe carbon dioxide from their operations and sequester it here in Illinois. But the backlash from farmers and other rural communities was so great that at least one of the developers has pulled out of that pipeline proposal. And I think later today we've got this ICC person, Illinois Commerce Commission. They were involved in that as well. And so, and then I'll also point out that, you know, the federal government, gosh, 20 years ago, spent, you know, several hundred million, if not billions of dollars on a quote unquote demonstration project to sequester and store carbon dioxide at an old coal-fired power plant here in Illinois. And it was during the George W. Bush administration. And it was much like the one that Michael mentioned in Texas. This one at least never got off the ground. It was a boondoggle that never worked. And Michael, I guess then the question is my thinking on this outdated? I remember reading papers years ago that said it would be too expensive to actually sequester carbon because all the electricity that would be needed to to do so would essentially make a power plant uneconomic. Has
Yeah,
that changed
so
at all?
yeah, so there are lots of things in there. So okay, let's separate this out. So when we talk about carbon capture and storage, let's think about it in 3 phases: capturing the carbon, moving the carbon, and putting the carbon underground. Capturing the carbon, super expensive, super hard to do. You're talking about FutureGen, I think, which was a coal, an IGCC, an integrated gasification combined cycle plant, which is not just carbon capture, it was a whole way of using coal in the first place. So they were trying to do 2 things at once. Not a great idea. Totally ran over budget, didn't work out, never got running. All right, FutureGen, that was 20 years ago. But there's the capturing this carbon, and it's really expensive and hard to capture carbon because from a coal-fired power plant, the carbon molecules are tiny and they're a very small part of the overall plume of gas coming out of the pipe. And so what you're doing when you're capturing carbon is you're sifting through a sea of little particles trying to find the carbon particles. And that just takes a lot of energy, just like if I put 5 apples in a haystack and asked you to find the apples because we need to remove them from the cow feed, it would take you a lot of energy because you're digging through the haystack, right, finding the apples. So that part is very expensive capital-wise, takes a lot of stuff, and it's also very expensive on an ongoing basis to run it because it takes a lot of energy to capture the CO2 and then take the CO2 and put it into like a concentrated form that you can put underground. Now, we separate it out because that type of carbon capture is stopping CO2 from getting in the atmosphere, like on a coal plant or a gas plant or an industrial facility. Again, it's CO2 would go into the atmosphere. We're going to capture it before it gets there. But we can also think about things like direct air capture, which is the CO2 is already in the atmosphere, and we need to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it underground. That is our carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions. All those little hatched bars that we saw at the bottom of the plots. And so again, very expensive, takes a lot of energy to do. And when it's in the atmosphere, like we talk about 450 parts per million is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So 450 parts per million of 1 million molecules you find in the atmosphere, 450 of them are carbon dioxide. So you're sifting through a lot of air, which is why we have fans blowing, just a massive undertaking, very difficult. All right. That is the capture part. Then you have to move it, and then you have to put it underground. Moving it and putting it underground, pretty easy relative to the capture part. I mean, moving it, if you're moving it short distances, you only need a few pipelines. We know how to build CO2 pipelines. We've got lots of them in the United States already. Putting it underground, we put lots of things underground. It's not difficult. We frack fields that are way more complicated than putting CO2 underground. So the movement, the pipelines, and the sequestration, not hard. It's the capturing that's the hard part. The hard part with the sequestration is making sure it stays underground, which is a whole, separate issue. But again, we've got whole workforces trained on the pipelines, on the sequestration. And there's a question about just this earlier and thinking about where these sites would go. I mean, one way you can look at CCS is, well, it can take a workforce that might disappear, like natural gas pipelines, if we're phasing them out. You've got people who work on those pipelines. You've got people who produce natural gas with great skill sets and retrain them to work on this very similar industry of moving CO2 and putting CO2 underground. All right, so that was that. But I think it's really important we separate. The capture is extremely difficult. The movement and putting it underground, if short distance, is much more economic. The challenge with the sequestration is making sure it stays underground. And there was the question about where are these sites? So I said 20 years ago, there are a bunch of demonstration sites. This is a map of those demonstration sites. These were funded. I think they all did examples of sequestration. So you can see they're spread nationally. And this is that atlas that I shared before. But there are a bunch of different maps for different formation types. These are offshore. Actually, offshore is a huge way that we can store CO2 as well. So you can see the pink shading there, lots of areas. Here are organic rich shale basins, which may be suitable for sequestration. Maybe, maybe not. You can see the spread out. Here are basalt formations, really great for storing CO2 actually, really, really great, but pretty scarce. We actually have some in the Great Lakes region, which is nice. Saline formations, these are pretty well established. They will work well. There's lots of them. Unminable coal, natural gas reservoirs, where we took out natural gas, we can put CO2 back in. So those are where our natural gas fields are, oil, sedimentary basins. So these formations are spread throughout the country. There are a lot of them. There's a way more sequestration potential than we could ever possibly use. The challenge is finding good sites for the actual injection, making sure it stays underground, and dealing with all the other challenges that we have. One more thing, sorry, that's the last thing. Michael, you mentioned ethanol. The other reason why I wanted to separate these out, capture, transport, and sequestration, is the magic of using carbon capture at ethanol is ethanol refineries already produce a pure CO2 stream coming out of them. So the ADM plant in Illinois, I mean, it's easy for them to capture CO2 because it's already done. They just take a pipeline and they bend it underground, and there you go, you captured your CO2. And so when we think about scaling up the carbon capture technology, the easiest way to do it is to start with pure CO2 streams when I don't have to spend the energy going through all these particles trying to find the CO2. And so that's why, basically the only CO2 capture facility operating nationally is this ethanol plant. And if we want to scale this up, you would scale it up at ethanol refineries in the Midwest first. Okay, that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. So on that note, folks, we're going to wrap things up and give you another half hour before another session. In our next following days, you will have longer breaks. This one is just cramming a lot of stuff in. But first, thank you so much, Michael and Angela, for spending your morning with us. We like to give them all a round of applause. This is the patented IJNR golf clap. We're very appreciative of your time. You've not heard the last of these folks. They are all going to get your contact info. And so I'm sure they'll be following up as questions arise. But that was an excellent overview. And we very much appreciate your time. For our journalists, we will see you right back here in about a half hour to dive deeper into policy and legislation at the state level. So stay tuned for that.